Hi everybody, this is Professor John Gillespie, and this is the video lecture on the founding of English America. What we're going to do here is we're going to start by looking at some of the challenges posed by some of the other nation states in 15th, 16th century Europe to the Spanish hegemony in the Americas, and then we're going to move on to the founding of English America, beginning with Jamestown and then moving on to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony up north. So let's get started. So let's take a look at an overview of the global situation and sort of foreshadow some of the things that we're going to be talking about. You'll recall that Christopher Columbus made landfall in what is today considered the Bahamas in 1492. Well, shortly after that, Portugal made its claim to Spain in 1494 as a consequence of the Treaty of Tordesillas. John Cabot, who is actually an Italian sailing for the English, made landfall in North America in 1497, but did not establish a permanent colony. Portugal then started to move more and more into the Indian Ocean trade and made a deal which guaranteed them exclusive trade with Calcutta in 1552. Portugal moved on to then claim Malacca in 1511. And then over in the west, Hernan Cortez landed in Mexico and conquered the Aztecs in 1519. And then Pizarro defeated the Inca down there in South America, in what is today Peru, in 1533. Coronado, also an explorer for the Spanish, claimed what we would consider today to be the American Southwest, parts of Texas and Oklahoma, all the way up in Kansas. That was in 1540. And sailing for the English, Martin Frobisher sighted land in Canada in 1576. So by 1550, the Spanish were the undisputed great power in the Atlantic world. They had established a colonial empire that was the largest on the map. Gold and silver from the Americas, from the silver mines and the gold mines of Central and South America helped to fuel a golden age for Spain. And so much precious metal was flowing out of the Americas and into Spain and then into the Eurasian economy that prices were offset as far away as Japan. So now we're going to take a look at some of challengers that arise to try to meet Spain on the high seas and establish empires of their own that are going to be just as profitable. And so the first character that we look at is named Jacques Cartier. He explored the coast of Newfoundland, which is in Canada today, between 1534 and 1541, and claimed North America for France. Of course, some of these claims are going to be pretty hard to defend later on, but nevertheless, this is what he's going to do. He continues on into the St. Lawrence River and reports back on claims of mineral wealth that is really greatly exaggerated. There's going to be no permanent settlement to come out of this, but nevertheless, he's going to be one of the early explorers to claim some of this land for France. Moving forward, you have Samuel de Champlain. He did actually establish landfall in what we today would call Canada, in Quebec in 1608, and that is just 1 year after the first English founding of Jamestown in 1607. Now, the purpose for Quebec was not for colonization, not primarily for colonization in the sense that we think of as families and settlers going to establish permanent homes in the land. Quebec was founded as a trading post. It was the first permanent French outpost in the New World. And Samuel Champlain was able to do what the English really were not ever able to do, and that is establish friendly relations with the Indians and trade with them in a way that is profitable to both, and establish a base for commercial development. So the French primarily monopolized the beaver trade, which sounds a little strange to us, but beavers were a highly sought after commodity in the early 17th century. Beaver hats and beaver coats were all the rage in Europe. Anybody who is anybody could be seen sporting some beaver gear. And so they worked with the local Indians and then traded for European goods. The French did not really establish large settlements as the English are later going to do. Like we said, the French were primarily establishing trading posts, which are smaller in scale, and you don't have lots and lots of families and permanent settlers moving in. And so, because they're not as land hungry, the Indians tend to prefer the French over the English, who are starting to come in there as early as 1607. Well, later on, the French sought to expand their presence into the Caribbean in 1635 with Guadeloupe and Martinique. So the big takeaway here is that the French are establishing commercial outposts, not settlements like the English are going to do. So the second challenger that we're going to look at are the Dutch. By 1600, they were already Europe's leading capitalist nation. They had established the Dutch East India Company in 1602, which conducted a lively trade in Asia and the Americas. And in 1609, they're ready to start the colonization game on their own. So the project that they undertake is called New Amsterdam, and it's established in 1625 by the Dutch. In 1609, the events leading up to this was in 1609, an English sea captain named Henry Hudson explored New York Harbor and the Hudson River and established a Dutch presence in the New York area. Of course, most of you probably know that New Amsterdam is going to turn into what we call New York today. And there he set up trading post for the Dutch West Indian Company. It's the sister company to the Dutch East India Company. And by 1625, this led to the formally established New Amsterdam, which is the first permanent Dutch colony in the New World. And by permanent, I mean it's going to be occupied up until this day, although it's not going to stay in Dutch hands. And so if you've had eighth grade history or perhaps high school history, you may have started off with the English colonies, the famous 13 English colonies. Well, the colonization game in Europe didn't start with England, but they sure did catch up quickly. So why wasn't England exploring, or exploring a lot anyway, in the 16th century? The reason is because England was preoccupied with religious conflict. And by that, I mean different factions within Christianity that are fighting one another. Different factions within Christianity that are fighting one another, and those are the Protestants and the Catholics. Another problem that England is dealing with is a dynastic crisis. Who is going to succeed the throne? Who is going to continue to rule? And then, of course, there are foreign policy issues, which is their biggest enemy, which would be Catholic Spain. So when Queen Elizabeth I comes to the throne, she establishes what is called a golden age, and that lasts from the time she assumes her reign in 1558 to her death in 1603. The religious question, whether we're going to be Protestant or Catholic, is going to be settled through what she calls the Via Media, and we will define that and get to that in just a little bit. And the dynastic question, well, the queen is going to decide who is going to succeed her, and that's going to be the end of that story. Spain is going to be your open question mark, and that the foreign policy issues in Spain is going to be dealt with in a major battle having to do with the Spanish Armada. But what we can take away as we start to explore this Elizabethan settlement is that England is energized and England is ready to start colonizing. So let's look at some of the early English ventures in North America. The first one, and we looked at this in the introduction, is made by John Cabot. And he was an Italian, and he was sailing under the English flag, a lot like Christopher Columbus was an Italian who was sailing under the Spanish flag. Well, in 1497, he made landfall, the first landfall on the North American coastline by an Englishman. And English fishermen then regularly visited Newfoundland, but nobody ever made a permanent settlement there. The next character that we look at is a man named Martin Frobisher, who made 3 voyages to North America in the 1560s, and he was looking for the Northwest Passage, that is an all-waterway that would take ships from the east coast of the North American continent all the way to the other end, let them pop out on the west coast. And you can imagine if somebody were to discover this, it would be they would be able to monopolize the trade in North America if you could claim that waterway. Of course, no such waterway exists, but for a very long time, for the next 3 centuries, explorers are going to be trying to find it. Well, Martin Frobisher returns home with 200 pounds of gold, or so he thinks. What he actually did return home with was iron pyrite, which is today known as fool's gold. So let's just say that Martin Frobisher's voyages did not pan out. So Queen Elizabeth's main foreign policy objective was to block and frustrate Spanish expansion and Spanish efforts to enlarge their empire. And so, to this end, she authorized so called privateers, such as this character to the left. His name is Francis Drake. And Francis Drake sailed around with the unacknowledged approval of the Queen and looted Spanish settlements at will. And he became so ugly and violent to the Spanish that he was known as El Drake. And the Queen, well, she knighted him, making him Sir Francis Drake in 1581. So each year, the English would harass all of the Spanish settlements or the Spanish settlements that were left open to it. And they started to take away more than 100,000 pounds away from Spain in this way. And as you can imagine, the Spanish are really annoyed by the English for these efforts. Well, in 1585, Elizabeth decided that it was high time that she commission a full colonization venture of her own. And so the guy to the left is named Sir Walter Raleigh. And his goal is to sail across the Atlantic and settle a colony at what's called Roanoke, which today is off the coast of North Carolina. He took just 117 people with him. And when he got there, he established very poor relations with the Croatoan, which is the name of the local Indian group. Well, the governor had to leave in 1587 in order to seek supplies and more people. And he was delayed by a major battle that was going on with Spain. And when he returned in 1790, he found that nobody was there. Everyone had disappeared. No trace of the settlers at all, not even the bodies, right? And so there was just one word leading to all kinds of speculation, and that word is Croatoan, which was etched on a tree. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the Croatoan wiped them out? Well, if that had been the case, surely there would have been bodies or signs of battle, and there's nothing like that. What a lot of scholars think happened is that the settlers, finding that they were unable to make it in the New World on their own, simply joined with the Croatoan Indians and assimilated into their culture. Well, if you go over to Spain, we have noted that Philip II of Spain absolutely hates England. One of the reasons for that is that England is a Protestant nation and Spain is a Catholic nation. And that in the 16th century is reason enough for going to war with each other. Furthermore, England's sea dogs, led by people such as Sir Francis Drake, have been raiding the Spanish settlements and slowly draining the Spanish coffers of a lot of the gold and the silver that they need to maintain their empire. Another reason is that England has been supplying the Protestant Netherlands, and that's a territory that Spain has been trying to conquer for some time and without a lot of success. And so Philip hatches a plan. Let's invade England, mainland England, and restore them to the Catholic faith. Well, to do this, he assembles the largest seaborne invasion fleet in history up to this point. It was called the Spanish Armada. And England can offer very little resistance to this well-supplied and well-trained fleet. But then what happens, to everybody's surprise, is that a terrible storm arrives. And so this supposedly invincible Spanish Armada, which was supposed to make landfall on the English coast and herald the invasion of England, bringing England back into the Catholic fold, turned out to be a great fiasco. The first thing that happened was a terrible storm wiped out the Spanish fleet. It knocked the boats into one another. These are old wooden ships. They're heavily armed with all kinds of cannon and gunpowder. And of course, they start to explode right there on the high seas. When the English see this, they're able to send out their smaller and more maneuverable ships to basically conduct a mop-up effort and claim a victory. And so the picture that you're looking at here is an English interpretation of the Battle of the Spanish Armada. And you can see the sort of ironic phrase down there, the Invincible Armado in 1888. And the Latin inscription at the top reads, "The hand of the Most High has done this," meaning that the English will attribute their victory against the Spanish to God. To their mind, God clearly favoring the Protestant faith over the Catholic faith. And so the defeat of the Spanish Armada signals Spain's decline and England's rise on the high seas and in the great game of colonization. This is the time in which Shakespeare's plays were written, most of them after 1589. This is when the English identity as a Protestant nation is confirmed and solidified, many people believing that God's seal of approval is on the Protestant faith. And England makes union with Scotland at this time as well. And for our story, the most significant development is that the seas are ours to explore, say the English. We are now free to maneuver about and conquer and colonize whatever we like without so much worry about Spain. And so promoters begin to sell investors on a really sweet deal in America. One of them is named Richard Hackelud. Let's look at what he says. He tells us, "There is under our noses the great and ample country of Virginia, the inland whereof is found of late to be so sweet and wholesome a climate, so rich and abundant in silver mines, a better and richer country than Mexico itself. If it shall please the Almighty to stir up her Majesty's heart to continue with transporting 1 or 2,000 of her people, she shall by God's assistance, in short space, increase her dominions, enrich her coffers, and reduce many pagans to the faith of Christ." Well, there's a couple of things that we want to note about this document. First, this is an advertisement. This is supposed to get people excited about colonizing. It's supposed to motivate people to get on ships, go over to the New World, and settle it. The other thing we want to point out is that he's calling really most of North America Virginia. We're going to know that as the name of a state today, but Virginia is actually a name given to honor not the Virgin Mary, as you might think, but to honor the supposedly virgin queen, Elizabeth I. Secondly, look at how he sells this land. Silver mines, better and richer country than Mexico itself. He's, of course, is comparing this to Spanish Mexico, which has helped to enrich Spain. And he's saying the same thing shall happen to us if we just get over there to Virginia and start accessing the natural resources that exist there. And the last thing he says is, we could also reduce many pagans to the faith of Christ, meaning we can go over there and spread the Protestant faith. Well, the first group that's going to make such an effort is called the Virginia Company. They organize in 1606. Now, they are what's called a joint stock company. That's a group of investors. These are folks that primarily want to go over to the New World. They want to score some gold or some silver or whatever they can find and enrich the people who helped finance the voyage. And so they go to James I, who's the King of England at the time, and they ask for a charter or official permission to go and settle this country of Virginia and find gold and make the partners that have helped to finance the voyage rich. And here's an interesting document that comes out of this, and I really want you to pay attention to what this document says. This is a portion of the Virginia Charter, which was written by the king and signed by the Virginia Company. And it says, "The persons being our subjects, which shall dwell and inhabit within every or any of the said several colonies and plantations shall have," and that that capitalization is not me, that's in the original document, shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities within any of our dominions, as if they had been abiding and born within this realm of England. And that's an important thing to realize because that establishes what is known to the settlers as the rights of Englishmen. And we can condense that down into a really, really quick summary. Basically, the people who get on boats and sail over to Virginia retain the same rights and liberties as those in England. And if you're born over in Virginia, you don't forfeit any of your rights. You're not a second class citizen. You retain all the same rights of Englishmen that people have in England. So there is no distinction between Virginians or Englishmen in Virginia and Englishmen in England. When the colonists who wanted to strike it rich arrive on the site that they called Jamestown after their patron King James I, they discover very quickly that they are woefully unprepared for life in the New World. It becomes apparent to them that they brought all the wrong stuff. They didn't bring anything that they could really use to eat or to plant, and they didn't bring enough farming equipment. But they did bring the equipment to test the quality of gold. And they brought glass blowers, which is an interesting decision. They also brought very few laborers. Most of the men who joined up with this were financial partners, and they don't get their fingernails dirty and wouldn't know how if you asked them to. So it turns pretty ugly pretty quickly. And they turn to raiding Indian graves and digging up the bodies and eating them. They turn to cannibalism within their own ranks. And so the result of all this is that the 300 colonists that they brought with them are reduced to 60 between 1609 and 1610. And the colony by 1611, 1612 is on the verge of collapse. So how are we going to save it? Well, on the next boat that comes over, a colonist is on board named John Rolfe. Now, John Rolfe has with him a clandestine cargo, that is contraband tobacco seeds. Where he got them, nobody knows. The Spanish Empire has a monopoly on the tobacco seed, and anybody caught smuggling it outside the Spanish Empire, it's punishable by death. So how he got his hands on some tobacco seeds, we just don't know. But he takes a chance on these tobacco seeds and he plants them in the Virginia soil. And guess what? Turns out to be a winner. Tobacco takes to the Virginia soil. It grows easier than a lot of other places. It's really swampy and you get a lot of rain there. The climate is really favoring the cultivation of tobacco. And so tobacco is what's going to put the colony on a firm financial footing. So because of tobacco, Jamestown goes from almost a ghost town to a boom town between 1612, which is the year that John Rolfe first tried out the tobacco seed in the soil, and 1644. So there it is. You can have a sort of an overview of the population. 1610, you're looking at 90 settlers. 1611, you jump to 120. By 1612, you see the success of tobacco and you get 400, but then look at 1622 and then 1644, Jamestown is certainly growing at a very fast pace. And so as tobacco takes root, so do more colonies, more English colonies begin to appear. And real quickly, and we will go over these in a later lecture in some detail, but you've got Maryland, which is established in 1633, North Carolina, 1653, and South Carolina splits off from that, and Georgia in 1732. So I know I'm jumping ahead a whole lot, but this is just to give you an idea of the development of what we call the plantation colonies. And Another way of talking about them is to talk about the southern colonies. They're primarily going to be colonies that are devoted to agriculture, and most of their livelihood and economic activity is going to revolve around agriculture. Well, soon after the Jamestown success, English colonization efforts really take off, and the English start to look to what we today call the British West Indies. And so in 1609, just a few years after the settlement of Jamestown, the English colonized Bermuda. 1624, St. Christopher. 1627, Barbados. And 1632, Antigua. 1628, Nevis, and Montserrat in 1632. All of these colonies are commercial in nature. That is, like Jamestown, they're going to be settled by various financial groups. Some joint stock companies, other kinds of financial instruments are going to be involved, but most of them are going to be commercial in nature. That is, the goal is to make money for the investors. How we're going to do this is first through tobacco and then through sugar. And one thing we want to point out is that Barbados is the first colony, the first English colony, in which is going to be completely dependent on slavery for its livelihood. And that's something we're going to certainly take a closer look at in later lectures. But the big takeaway here is that the American colonies, that is the English colonies in America, are becoming economic cash cows for the mother country. 1619 is also a troublesome date in U.S. history. One thing that happens at this time is the establishment of the House of Burgesses. And we look back at this as the beginning of American democracy, or at least where the seeds of American democracy are first planted, because this is the first elected legislative body in the New World. That is, that the House of Burgesses makes decisions and enacts laws and passes those laws on behalf of the colonists who live in Virginia. And so it acts as a parliament, or if you will, as a sort of a embryonic Congress. Now, although England maintains veto power over these laws, she rarely does so, not to upset the colonies that are producing so much wealth. And so the House of Burgesses functions really quite autonomously from England. And to this, we can trace the beginnings of what we call American democracy. Ironically, and much more tragically, 1619 marks the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to Virginia. Historians have traced this commerce back to a Dutch middleman who sailed over with the first 20. And where were they from? We're not sure. Were they from Africa? We don't know. Were they other transplants from the Bahamas? We do not know. And another thing that we don't know about, or we're not sure about, is their legal and their social status. That is, were they something of a servant? Were they considered a slave? Were they a slave for life? These are open questions and under current investigation by scholars right now. Well, however you look at it, is a historical irony that 1619 saw the beginnings of American democracy, which we generally think is a good thing and something that's prized within the American identity. And it's also the beginning of American slavery. So it is a troublesome date for us. So we're going to look at another side of English colonization. That's the Puritans, who established a settlement in Massachusetts. But before we do that, we're going to look at the background of Catholic Europe. Before 1517, all of Europe was Roman Catholic. That is, that's the only game in town if you're a Christian. And almost everybody in Western Europe is Christian. And now you probably know that the Roman Catholic Church then and now is under the spiritual leadership of the Bishop of Rome, who is known as the Pope. Christian unity is held together, the system of competing states rather loosely, and kept Europe in a fragile peace as Christian brothers. Well, we know that Europeans certainly went to war with other Europeans, but we also know that this warfare probably would have been a lot more incessant had it not been for the stabilizing factor of Christianity. Well, in 1517, a German monk whose name is Martin Luther begins to raise questions about some of the Catholic Church's core doctrines. And what comes of Martin Luther's protest, and that's where we get the word Protestant, is three core principles. And those principles are faith alone, grace alone, and scripture alone. You see, Martin Luther was actually challenging what was called the sale of indulgences. That is, sort of a salvation for a price. You pay the church a certain amount of money, and they give you a certificate saying that you've got some time out of purgatory. Martin Luther thought this was a bad idea, and he didn't think this is how God operates. And so the Protestant principles of faith alone means that you are saved or made right with God by your faith in Jesus and his atoning work on the cross alone. And that happens through grace alone. In other words, not through work or merit of your own, but by the grace of God alone, and scripture alone, meaning the Bible. And where does a Christian go for teaching on faith and morals? According to a Protestant, the only sure place you can go is not the church, not the church's history, not your local parish priest, but the Bible alone. And you can see the picture there to the left. You have Martin Luther gesturing directly to the Bible, which is where Protestants are going to receive all of their teaching on faith and morals. Well, the Christian sects that follow, you have a lot more groups that are going to start to separate from Rome in the 16th century. And although they're going to vary in practice, and they're going to vary in style, and they're going to vary in how they interpret the Bible, they're all going to hold to these three principles: faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. And so if you're a Lutheran, that's certainly going to be your belief. If you're a Presbyterian, that's going to be your belief. And later on, some of the groups like Baptists or Methodists are all going to hold to those beliefs: faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Well, a second generation reformer, somebody to come after Martin Luther, his name was John Calvin, who started teaching in 1541. He agreed with Luther. He said, yeah, Luther's got it right. Faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, absolutely. But his reading of scripture is a little bit different than Martin Luther's was. And this is a quote from John Calvin. He says, God preordained for his own glory and the display of his attributes of mercy and justice, a part of the human race, without any merit of their own, to eternal salvation, and another part, in just punishment of their sin, to eternal damnation. And that's the best summation that I can find to give you John Calvin's idea of predestination. In other words, God has selected from time immemorial who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. And guess what? There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. If you're a member of the elect, you're going to heaven. If not, sorry, too bad, you're going to the other place. Well, in England, the Protestant Reformation took kind of a middle path. And so historians call that the Via Media, or the middle way. They eventually settled, the English church, English Christianity, eventually settled at something of a midpoint between Catholicism and Protestantism. And I'll show you what that means in a little bit more detail on that. But that means that the English church retained the form and the liturgy of Catholicism, but also taught explicitly core Protestant doctrine. Now, that wasn't the case at the beginning. The English church began to split off from Rome under Henry VIII. He broke from the Catholic Church in 1534, and he didn't break off from the church because he had any kind of deep theological conviction or any kind of spiritual anxiety about staying with Rome. Actually, what he wanted was an annulment from his wife, who was unable to, from his perspective, unable to give him a male heir. So he arranged for an annulment from his wife, and he couldn't do it within the Catholic Church. So his idea was, well, I'll just split off from the Catholic Church and establish my own church. And that was the Church of England. And the Church of England was very Catholic, retained Catholic doctrine, Catholic teaching, Catholic liturgy. He did allow English Bibles into the churches. But instead of the Pope in Rome being the spiritual head, it was really Henry himself who was the sort of the head of the church. And so it's an awkward hybrid, this Anglican church or Church of England under Henry. And then Henry's children that would be born through his various wives. He had many wives, as you know. They would embrace different forms of Christianity. So his son, who was the first one to succeed him, his name is Edward VI, took the English church in a very Protestant turn and abolished a lot of the Catholic teaching and a lot of the Mass and some of the things that we associate with Catholicism. But then his sister, his half-sister, Mary I, who we call Bloody Mary because of her enthusiastic persecution of Protestantism, decided she was going to return England to Catholicism. And so if you're just the man in the pews or the person in the pews at this time, you'd certainly be confused. One day you go to church and you realize, hey, we're reading out of an English prayer book in English and everything's very Protestant. And then you show up the next day and we're celebrating the Catholic Mass again, right? So this sort of roulette of religion is happening with Henry's children. Well, by the time that Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne, she decides, and through her advisors, they come up with a plan to end this dissension within Christianity, within English Christianity. And she formally establishes the Via Media, or the middle way. Your church looks very Catholic in Elizabethan England, but it has a very broad appeal. In other words, you can be Catholic from a certain perspective. Catholicism is actually illegal in England, but she's not going to openly persecute Catholics the way Edward did. She says famously, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls." In other words, she does demand outward conformity. She does insist that you be a formal member of the English church, but your inward faith is yours. Your own ideas about, I don't know, the sacrament of the Mass, or is it really Jesus's body and blood, or is it a symbol? Elizabeth says, hey, this is up to the individual believer. We're not going to press these issues too far. And so the middle way, or the Via Media, is established as the English way. Well, by the late 16th century, England is hopelessly religiously divided. The Catholics continue to dominate Spain, France, Italy, and Poland. The Lutherans are going to take root in parts of Germany and Denmark and Scandinavia. And the Anglican form of Christianity, or the Church of England, established first by Henry and then the Via Media in under Elizabeth, that's going to take root in England, of course. But then to the north, Calvinism is going to take root in Scotland. And so you've got this patchwork of religious identity and practice that prevails throughout Europe. Well, within England, you also have a lot of dissension. There's a Calvinist group in England that call themselves the Puritans. And if you look at the map, those are the parts of the map, primarily in southern England, where the Puritans are going to come from. And this is the group that's going to lead the main migration over to Massachusetts in the New World. And so this is the group that we're going to follow closely from now on. So the English Calvinists, as we said, are called the Puritans. They believed that the Via Media, the English church, had not gone far enough in its reforming of Catholicism. The English or the Anglican Church was too Catholic to their mind. It retained too many of the teachings and the traditions and the old trappings of Catholicism. And so the Puritans, they call themselves Puritans because they actually they're it wasn't themselves that called themselves Puritans. It was their enemies that called them Puritans because they felt they were on a mission to purify England and make it more holy. And so they object to certain things that's left over within Anglicanism. They object to the presence of priests. They don't like priests who wear vestments and they don't and celebrate the Mass. They object to some of the physical trappings like altars and candles and vestments and stained glass windows and all these things. They find all of this to be too Catholic. But the one thing they really cannot stand, the one thing they just cannot suffer, is how the Anglican Church has retained what's called the episcopacy, or the episcopal office. That's the office of bishop. And most Protestant churches had done away with the office of bishop, but the Anglicans are holding on to it, and there are still Anglican bishops today. And so for the Puritan, there is one source of religious authority, and that is the Bible. And, if you pressed an Anglican, he would say that too. Oh yeah, the Bible's my sole source of authority. But the Puritans take it to an extreme, if you will. They're very literalistic in their reading of the Bible. And they go as far as to say that if it's not in the Bible or not explicitly taught in the Bible, well, we can't do it. And so there's nothing to be inferred, and nothing's to be imposed on the text. It's the Bible and the Bible alone. And so, as we said, for a Puritan, the Church of England is hopelessly corrupt. It's too popish. It's too Catholic for them. And so a group of Puritans, known as the Separatists, say that true believers, if you're really a Christian, well, you must leave the Anglican Church and get out. They take as their proof text for that 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 16 and 17. What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. That command to leave what is seen as corrupt and wrong. And so the Puritans say that God has chosen some people for salvation, others for damnation. That's a teaching of John Calvin. And so it's the elect, those that God has chosen, versus the damned, those that God has chosen for something else. And they take their text there from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. He, that is God, predestined us to be adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. In him we were also chosen, having been predestined. So these are the key proof texts for the Puritans, proving, first off, that we cannot stay within a church that is not entirely holy and to our understanding of the Bible. And secondly, we are the elect. We are God's chosen people, and as such, we have a mission to get out and found his community. And for a Puritan, every true believer has to have what's called a conversion experience, something that both personally and publicly demonstrates God's favor. One historian named Patricia Caldwell put it like this. She says a Puritan has to have a testimony of personal religious experience, spoken or read aloud to the entire congregation of a gathered church before admission, that is membership into the church, as evidence of the applicant's visible sainthood. In other words, you have to somehow demonstrate publicly to the congregation that you are a member of the elect. And this comes down into our own or contemporary religious experience as the testimony. You have to have a testimony, some Christians say. And the Puritans say that they are living under a covenant or a contract or an agreement with God. God is holding us to a standard because we are the chosen people. One of the Puritan ministers that we're going to hear about in the coming slides here is named John Winthrop. He writes, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. Now, if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission. But if we shall neglect the observation of these articles and shall fail to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." So we better keep it because God's watching, and He might not be happy if we break our contract with Him. So for a Puritan, it's not just a matter of isolating ourselves and living out our lives according to God's teachings, but we also have to be a light of the world. We have to bring others to the light. And that is what's known as their understanding of a certain passage out of the Bible, which references the city on a hill. In other words, we chosen, we elect, we Puritan, frozen chosen, we are the world's only hope for salvation. Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, "You are the light of the world. A town built upon a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." And so now I want to call out a sermon by John Winthrop called A Model of Christian Charity, in which he tells the Puritan people, we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. Well, the Puritans do not leave England and directly go to the New World. In fact, in 1608, they leave England for Holland, and they don't care for Holland very much because Holland is very tolerant. They allow all sorts of faiths to commingle and exist with one another, all kinds of different Protestant faiths, and even Jews. And, well, the Puritans don't care for that. They want their own land, they want their own communities to run it as they see fit. And so in 1620, they make an agreement with the Virginia Company, and they agree to become workers in exchange for land and, most importantly to them, religious freedom. And so then in 1620, they board a ship called the Mayflower, and they head for Virginia, but unfortunately are blown off course and end up somewhere else. Where do they go? Well, they end up 620 miles north at a place they call Plymouth Plantation, meaning they've been planted there. And before they get off the ship, before they get off the Mayflower, the men of the congregation sign a document which has come down to us as the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact says, well, we are loyal subjects of the king. So if you're expecting the Mayflower Compact to say, we're done with this whole English thing and we're going to do our own thing, no, not at all. They consider themselves to be Englishmen, and they consider themselves to be the loyal subjects of the king. But while they say that, they also say something that's a little bit more, let's say, revolutionary, if that's not too strong a word. They say that we will form a civil body politic. Now, that's interesting because a civil body politic is a government. So, how can you both, on the one hand, be a loyal subject of the king and at the same time say you're going to form your own government? They also say that decisions will be made democratically, or that is, by all male church members. So, what is this Mayflower document? Is it a constitution? No, not exactly. Is it a Declaration of Independence? No, certainly not. I think the best way that we can describe it is it's a promising step toward self-government. Well, with the success of the Plymouth Plantation, other Puritans in England decide that it's their time to get out and to make landfall and make a new life for themselves in the New World. And this is what's known as the Great Migration. Charles I of England granted the Puritans a charter to go and to settle in the colonies. And if you'll note from the map to the right, they went to more than just Massachusetts. They ended up all over the New World. The largest single destination being Barbados. 18,000 of these Puritans go and they settle on the colony of Barbados. And the purpose for Charles doing this is, well, we can use them for cheap labor in the colonies. And as we know, the colonies are cash cows. And we can keep them from making trouble in England. So if they want to go and read the Bible in their own weird way over in Barbados, what trouble is that to us? So in what's known as the Great Migration of the 1630s and 40s, you have approximately 15,000 people, and of course not all of them are Puritans, who leave England for a new life in the colonies. There, the story that we're going to follow is the establishment of what's called Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 under a fellow named John Winthrop, Governor John Winthrop. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony, established in 1630, was led by John Winthrop. You see, Plymouth never grew much beyond 7,000. In fact, was overshadowed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony under the governorship of Winthrop. It was chartered in 1629 and settled in 1630, as we've mentioned, and it included no provision for government to be based in London, which is curious. And so one of the results of this is they're going to be North America's first self-governing colony. Well, Winthrop's rule is not exactly what you hear about sometimes in your elementary school history, or if you've studied the history of the first Thanksgiving or something like that. Winthrop hated democracy. He thought it was a terrible idea. How can people decide what God has already decided from time immemorial? He writes, a democracy is, amongst civil nations, accounted the meanest and worst of all forms of government. It would allow it would be a manifest breach of the Fifth Commandment. So he thought very little of the idea that human beings were suited to rule themselves. He thought that God's rule was much to be preferred. And so to that end, dissenters, or people that have a religious belief other than what the good Puritan ministers have decided is true, were not to be tolerated and were in fact expelled and in some cases executed. Well, nevertheless, the Massachusetts Bay Colony grew. 80,000 Britons are going to migrate there in 1630s. Well, as we had noted, the Puritans are fanatically anti-Catholic. There's nothing that they would suffer in Catholicism. They did not like fancy religious ceremony. The Puritan ministers, they insisted dress in plain clothes instead of the clerical collar. They did not wear liturgical vestments or anything like that. And part of this goes with the banning Catholic holidays, including Christmas, because if the root of Christmas is Christ's Mass, and we're not going to have that, they say we can't find any justification for this in the Bible. And so, no, we're not going to be celebrating Christmas. The Puritans, they meant to keep public order under God's rule. And so, you're not going to have any of these things. No kissing, no card playing, no dancing, no going to the theater, no gambling, no Sabbath breaking. All of these are not only going to be church rules, but they're also going to be civic rules. You see, the Puritans, they did not believe in the separation of church and state. Why would we do that if God knows best? And so when you messed up, that was a sin, not just against God, but against the body of Christ, which is the church itself. And so because sin is not just a private matter, it has to be dealt with publicly. Now, one of the ways that the Puritans would deal with sinners is through what's called the pillory. And you can see a picture of that off to the right. The pillory is where a guy or a person would stand on the pillar his head and his wrists would go through the three holes that you see there, and he would simply stay there for a while for everyone to look at. Now, although this is probably quite uncomfortable and no one would want to enter into this, the idea here was not to calculate pain, but was to calculate shame, because you would have to stand there in the midst of your brothers and sisters in Christ and publicly declare yourself to be a sinner, and you have to publicly confess and show repentance. This is the key here. It's meant to be public. Another one is the Scarlet Letter. Now, maybe you had read Nathaniel Hawthorne's famous novel by the same phrase, in which the female protagonist Hester Prynne was found guilty of adultery and had to go about in public wearing a big scarlet A for adultery sewn onto her clothes. Well, this has its origins in history. There was a scarlet A for adultery. There was all sorts of scarlet letters that you could wear, B's and C's and D's and F's, depending on the sin, depending on the offense. So you have to sew this thing on, and that would be a public declaration of your sin and a public declaration of your repentance. An interesting one that I've looked into was called the ducking booth, and this is when someone, usually, in fact, almost exclusively a woman, was put on something of a seesaw. And part of that seesaw would be on dry land, and then the other part would go ducking into a body of water, usually a lake or a river. And women would be fastened onto this thing and ducked and brought back up. And again, the purpose was not to suffocate someone. It certainly was not kill someone. It was to silence them. And so we can read into this with all sorts of interesting explanations and interpretations, but the fact that this seems to be reserved for women only, and most of the crimes were verbal crimes. Women said things they weren't supposed to say, or they contradicted their husbands, or they spoke out of turn at church. This seems to reflect a fear of women who speak. It seems to reflect a fear of women who speak their minds. And when we run into a woman called Anne Hutchison in a few minutes, we'll see how this seems to be absolutely true. And so, what was a crime? What could you get in trouble for in New England? Well, today we attach a lot of laws and punishments over property, right? Theft is a really big one to us. Well, the Puritans valued piety over property. They valued how you conducted yourself over, in public, over, how much wealth or something like that you had. And on the top of the list were sexual sins. You had to be absolutely faithful to your wife or to your husband if you were married. And if you were not married, then you were expected to be absolutely abstinent. So any kind of sexual sin or suggestion of sexual sin was dealt with the utmost seriousness and severity. Also, sins that transgressed proscribed gender roles seem to be taken very seriously. So men who did not act as men are supposed to act, or women who act out of character for however women are supposed to act, those can also be interpreted as sin and published or punished publicly. We'd already noted that women who spoke their minds could find themselves on the wet end of the ducking booth, and this is just one example of that. So the Puritans really did seem to be concerned with maintaining a order that they interpreted to be God's order. Well, you do have some cracks that begin to appear in the Puritan facade. Some challengers. And the first major challenger, dissenter that we're going to look at is a guy named Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams arrived in New England in 1631 as a godly minister. He was to pastor a local church. Well, Soon after he gets there, he begins to criticize the Puritan establishment. He begins to say that they're too authoritarian, that they're imposing laws that need not to be imposed. They're being too harsh. And he says that the real covenant, the real agreement, is not between the individual and the state, or the church and the state, but it's between the individual and God. And so no one, says Roger Williams, should be forced to go to church. No one should be forced to admit a certain doctrine or something like that. And a quote from him is, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." So Williams' radical idea, and the idea for which he gets himself in a lot of trouble, is he proposes the complete separation of church and state. All faiths, says Roger Williams, should be treated equally. That even includes non-Christian religions, such as the Indians' religion. Now, as you can imagine, the Puritan establishment, those old dudes in those ruffled white collars, they're getting very hot under the ruffled white collar when they hear these things. And Roger Williams, he goes on and he says that imposed religion, when government imposes religion, that is soul rape. That's his words. So what happened to poor Williams? Williams was relieved of his pastorship of Salem Church, and he was banished to England. In other words, get out of the New World. This is for the godly. You all go away. And he decided he wasn't going to go to England. He was going to flee. And so he took off with a group of his own followers and established what today we call, or he called it that too, Providence, in what is today Rhode Island. And there he founded the first Baptist church in the United States. You did have Baptists in England, but Roger Williams signed on with a group called the Baptists and helped to develop the Baptist doctrine and preaching in America, and founds the first Baptist church in the U.S. So the second dissenter, or somebody who had a problem with Puritan teaching, her name is Anne Hutchinson. You can already tell that she's going to run into some trouble because of her gender. She arrived in Boston in 1634 and soon claimed that she had a special revelation from God. She says one may preach a covenant of grace more clearly than another, but when they preach a covenant of works for salvation, that is not the truth. Now, what does she mean by that? She's simply taking the idea of predestination to its logical extreme, meaning, well, if God has decided who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, well, what good is any of this? And by that, she gestures encompassingly to the Puritan establishment, all of the pews, all of the Bibles, all of the pulpits, and even you, good godly ministers. What is the purpose of all of you, right? And she begins to teach these things in Bible studies that she holds in her home. At first for women, but then when men start to show up and listen to the teachings of Anne Hutchinson, that is what lands her in trouble. So her ultimate crime was that she questioned the need for Puritan ministers. They try her in court in 1638 and find her guilty of crimes, and this is a quote, unbecoming of her sex. And she, like Roger Williams, is banished to Rhode Island. Well, North America is not empty when the Virginia settlers arrive. In fact, Jamestown was situated in a Native American confederacy called Tensacoma, and I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, but my apologies. Now, Tensacoma was led by a chief whose name was Powhatan. Powhatan is the chief of chiefs. He's something like a chief executive, if you will. He used diplomacy, warfare, marriage, and intimidation to control other groups, gain their allegiance, and exact tribute from them. But he ran something something between a confederacy and an empire. In 1607, after the Jamestown settlers had arrived, Powhatan decided that he would incorporate Jamestown into his confederacy. And if he incorporates them, then he can do what he does with other groups. He can control them, gain their allegiance, and exact tribute from them. See, he did not realize the broader political situation that Jamestown represented. Well, Powhatan made plans for an elaborate ceremony through which Jamestown and the Jamestown settlers would be incorporated into the Powhatan Confederacy. And so he kidnapped one of the colony's leaders, whose name is John Smith. And he then prepared to execute Smith, but not really. It was all political theater. It was a mock ceremony. You see, when he put John Smith's head on the chopping block, his 9-year-old daughter was to rush forward, throw herself on Smith, and beg for his life. And so Smith thought that Powhatan's 9-year-old daughter, whose name was Pocahontas, he thought that she was in love with him, and that this was a sacrificial act, and that Powhatan recognized Smith's, manly superiority in all of this, and decided that we needed to keep him alive out of fear or something like that. This wasn't the Powhatan or the Indian understanding at all. This was, in fact, an adoption ceremony in which Smith, whose life was spared, rose again to a new life as Powhatan's subordinate. Well, here's what John Smith's journal records record. These are the words of Powhatan. He says, "Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and fly into the woods, and then you must be consequently famished by wrongdoing your friends. What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply our wants if you will come in a friendly manner and not with swords and guns to invade an enemy. I am not so simple as not to know that it is better to eat good meat, lie well, and sleep quietly with my women and children, to lie and be merry with the English, and being their friend to have copper, hatchets, and whatever else I want, than to fly from them all, to lie cold in the woods, feed upon acorns, roots, and such trash, and so to be hunted, that I cannot rest, eat, or sleep." Well, as interesting of a story as the John Smith and a Pocahontas tale is, it was actually tobacco that determined the relations between the Powhatan Indians and the Jamestown settlers. You see, tobacco is a thirsty crop. It uses up the soil and demands more. And so, as the crop became more and more successful and demand increased in Europe for tobacco, that caused an increase in immigration from Europe as well. And so, with more immigration, more pressure to grow more, so increases the pressure to obtain, settle, and cultivate more land. Powhatan, of course, knew this and became increasingly alarmed, saying, "Your coming is not for trade, but to invade my people and possess my country." Well, just like the Virginia settlers, New Englanders likewise made landfall in a territory occupied by indigenous people. In the 1630s, the native territory was squeezed between the Dutch and the English settlements. You can see on the map. Well, the Dutch allied with a Indian group called the Pequot for trade and for defense. And because they were allied with the Pequot, this annoyed the Puritans. See, the Puritans did not believe that anybody had title to the land, anybody had a right to the land other than them. They believed that their presence was divinely ordained by God, and that they were appointed to establish their city on a hill. God had said so, And disease that they saw spreading among the Indians, well, this wasn't the effect of biology or any of the things that we talked about in our first lecture. This was God's doing, pure and simple. They held the title to the land by virtue of their pure Christianity, so they thought. John Winthrop said, "If God were not pleased with our inheriting these parts, why doth he still make room for us by diminishing them by disease as we increase?" So this leads to what historians now call the First Pequot War in 1637. And it was over, as most of these disputes are, over territory. Territory and the fur trade led English Puritans, allied with their Indian enemies of the Pequot, to attack a Pequot village. And there, between 700 and 500 men, women, and children were slaughtered. Puritan Governor William Bradford recalled, "Those that scraped the fire were slain with the sword, and some hewed to pieces, other ruined through with their rapiers, as so they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived that they destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. The victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers therefore to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy." Well, you know what? The Puritans also had another aspect to their faith, and they're Christians after all. And Christians have a duty to be on a mission of evangelism, to spread the message of Jesus. And this is also part of Puritanism. They told themselves that they were also on a mission of evangelism. And if you look really closely at the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you can see a little text bubble coming out of that Indian's mouth. And that text bubble says, "Come and help us." Meaning they're imposing on the Indians a belief that the Indians want them to come and spread the message of Jesus. But the nagging question that the Puritans have is, can these Indians really truly be among the elect? I mean, we left so many heathens back in Europe. How could we really find true Christians here in America? Cotton Mather, one of the Puritan ministers, says probably the devil delivered these miserable savages to America in hopes that the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ would never come here. I think Cotton Mather was probably hoping that was the case, but nevertheless, the Puritans say, we have a mission to try to teach the Indians about Jesus. And so, beginning in 1646 and ending in 1675, the Puritans established what was called praying towns. These were sort of camps established to convert Indians to Christianity. If that is even possible. So there's a lot of people that have a lot of skepticism about these praying towns and whether Indians can truly be converted. Still, this is the mission of the praying town, is to essentially turn natives into white men. That's what the Puritans see as being the main mission. So the Puritan minister, John Eliot, took the lead in doing this, and he was sincere. He wanted to spread the gospel among the Indians as best as he could, and so he translated the Bible into Algonquin, which is the language of the major language family among the Indians there, and established 14 of these praying towns. And it was more than just Bible study, okay? The purpose of the praying towns was not just to teach the Bible, but was to teach the Indians to essentially be white men, to give up hunting and gathering and take up farming, which the Puritans thought of as a more godly lifestyle. They also taught to enforce English notions of family and gender and economics, seeing these as God's way and the other ways are just bad. And were the praying towns successful? The answer is, well, no, not really. You had approximately 1,000 Indians who lived in these praying towns, and relatively very few, if any, genuinely joined the Puritan congregations. Of those that did, whose name is registered somewhere in the baptismal records or of these churches, they most likely saw it as a means to security after the devastation of the Pequot Wars. Well, by 1670, the English are outnumbering the Indians in America 3-1. And as the English become more numerous, then you start to see disputes over trade and land begin to increase more and more as the English gain the upper hand and make more demands on the Indians. And this is not an acceptable scenario nor an acceptable future to the Wampanoag leader named Metacom. And Metacom is known as King Philip to the English. And the inciting incident in the next big conflict, which is known as King Philip's War, is when the Indians start killing the English hogs that wander off of their property and devastate Indian cornfields. Well, Metacom's War ensues over one of these incidents in 1675. Metacom orders an attack on all English settlements. It's a coalition of natives, that is, natives from just about every tribe and society that want to join together, increase their strength in numbers, and try to wipe out the English once and for all. And they did a pretty good job, actually. They destroyed 1/5 of the English settlements, killing 5% of the adult population. And it is the most devastating war in all of colonial history. Well, in time, Metacom, or King Philip, is captured. He's betrayed by an Indian who is working in the service of the English. And the English decide to make quite an example of him. They quarter him, they mutilate him, and put his head on a pike, which is carried through Plymouth Colony on display. And so the sad aftermath of King Philip's War, Metacom War, is that it's the most brutal war in 17th century history, and it's the most costly war in American history. We have not had another war in which we've seen 5% of the total population killed. It eliminates the Wampanoag as a political or a military force, and it solidifies in European mind the image of Indians as savages that have to be exterminated. And so on this slide, we will end this video lecture taking note that as you see the white population soar into the uncharted regions of this graph, you see the black population hold relatively stable, and you see the Indian population just shrink.